we really wanted there to be a dialogue element to what we did in this conference. And one of the ways we thought we could do a dialogue element is we could get the 7 people who did the presenting and let them do some push and pull against each other. And to, because they know this material that they've been working through. And so I've asked Jordan Munson, who is our professor of Old Testament and missions, and he also directs our Center for Faith Integration and Vocation here at Huntington University. I've asked him if he would kind of facilitate this interaction among them, but also, assuming there's time, it will include questions from you as well, and I'll have that mic when that time comes. So there you go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, guys. I'm thinking maybe for the first half, we'll have our panelists ask each other questions, and we'll try to be nice, like reviewer number 1 and not like the infamous reviewer number 2, right, on your... So we'll ask some questions. Feel free to push and pull a little bit. Sometimes in Q&As, we can get into this weird thing where like every panelist feels like they need to respond, so we'll just have 1 or 2 responses, and if there's a natural ongoing dialogue, then it makes sense to keep going. Otherwise, we can move on. So we'll each maybe have a question for others, and then about halfway through, I'll transition and start getting questions from the audience. Sound good? So I think we're getting some volunteering here. Dr. Noble, would you start us off with a question? Is that all right?
Sure. Let's see. I actually wrote down a couple of thoughts in anticipation of perhaps being in exactly this position. All right. I will. All right, so the question I wanted to ask is regarding the presentation on contemplation. Yeah, I know, fun. To what extent, as you read the book and you were looking at the 4 different pathways, to what extent did you, Jeff, consider contemplation as a category of attentiveness where the subject is the inner self?
Yeah.
Softball.
Yeah, that's one of, I think one of the things I noticed, or maybe even one of the challenges in preparing was like, how do you differentiate? Because as you are putting your finger on here, Dr. Noble, right, the pathway of attentiveness is required to be attentive to the inner self and the pathway of contemplation. Much like, right, as we sit and contemplate some big, deep questions, hopefully out of that inspires us to move towards the pathway of compassion, the pathway of care. And I think, so very much so, yes, to the overlaps there. One of the challenges I was saying to Kent earlier, it was pulling things out of a 20-minute presentation that would love to be included, but just don't have time.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your presentation on contemplation. Thank you.
Right.
If I may actually jump in, I have a question for Dr. Noble. As somebody in the natural sciences and with that being your academic discipline, I'm comfortable sharing. I failed out of mechanical engineering, and it just because my brain didn't work that way, and it was really difficult. So I'm thankful my parents still were supportive in my pursuits of an undergrad education in philosophy, right? But Dr. Noble, I'd appreciate hearing a bit more about the phenomenon of joy connected to the pathway of attentiveness, because sometimes when we're thinking about the minutia of the details of the atom, I get overwhelmed. But I'm sure for the scientists, there's a lot of joy in those moments. So we'd love to hear a bit more about how maybe the virtue of joy or the phenomenon of joy is connected to that pathway for you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I actually, I think of Aristotle as someone who really does a great job embodying and deconstructing this idea that we have that philosophy and the natural sciences are different. So of course, Aristotle was a philosopher in the way we think of philosophy, but also a natural scientist in the way that we think of that today. So just that we use constructs to help us understand the world and to think about what we're going to think about, and to help scaffold our thinking. And that's a great benefit of those constructs, but it also limits us when we start to think about them being different in ways that perhaps they aren't as different as we think. But you asked me about joy, and so I'll circle back to that. I have a really dear friend who's a philosopher, and he asked me, this must have been more than 10 years ago, he asked me, doesn't it take the joy away when you can actually explain how things work? Like, as if the mystery, having mystery in something was part of what brought joy. And I think it's kind of a both and as a natural scientist, when I figure out how something works, particularly something that's really complicated, when you figure out how that works and how it happened, there is a sense of wonder and awe and joy in that. For me, I was a natural scientist who then went later into education. I started out as a engineer for Intel Corporation and worked with microprocessors. And people ask how I found my way back. I found my way back because I enjoyed developing people so much more than I enjoyed developing microprocessors. And that speaks to that deep joy that comes from kind of sharing wonder with other people. So there's a really communal part of that too.
You guys are great. Who's got a question for the Jacobsons?
I've been emailing with the Jacobsons for weeks. Leading up to this paper, I didn't want to make a total fool of myself. So I was emailing them questions about the content just to make sure I was getting it right, because if I headed one direction and you guys headed another, it just would have been mortifying. And I've been thinking about this question related to my students. My students are in my mind all the time today. And for many of my students, fortress thinking has been envisioned for them as like a virtue. Like, this is actually what you're supposed to do. But in your book, you push pretty hard against fortress thinking as a virtue. And so I wonder, what would you say, what do you think, what's not the solution? What's the pathway look like? What's the pilgrimage look like for a student maybe who's come from an environment where fortress thinking is a virtue? That's the thing we're supposed, and then they come here expecting maybe to their educational institution, especially maybe a Christian one, to just fortify the fortress. And we're trying to beckon them out onto the path. It's a really difficult rub sometimes, relationally, educationally. So I just wonder about your thoughts on that. For the student who comes in maybe with fortress thinking, what's that pilgrimage look like for them?
I think this is clearly an answer to my wife.
I think what you're experiencing is being experienced at every kind of institution in America right now. I don't think that fortress thinking is particularly unique to Christian campuses. Again, because of Jake and I working, the last two books we did were written for the broader academy about religion. So we visited a lot of different campuses. And faculty at the liberal arts colleges, faculty at military academies, faculty at R1s, all of them asked questions. They didn't call it fortress thinking, that's our language, but it was that same inquiry about what do we do when students think that the important thing is to stand up for what they know is true for everybody. And I guess I'd say the good news here is I think that Christian campuses can be places where you articulate pilgrimage, where you say, all of us are pilgrims. And the virtue of our campus is that people can have different perspectives and we're all learning together. And I think it's a really great opportunity. And I hope that Christians who teach at other kinds of campuses as well will pick up on that. And to be honest, if when you read our book, you will find that a lot of what we talked about in here, have talked about in our talk today, is not there. Because we wrote the book hoping it would work for any faculty member at any campus to say, we're going to do intellectual inquiry as pilgrims. We are not going to be doing this as I'm right and you're wrong.
But I think it's a really good question, and it's a pedagogical question. You know, I think part of it is when you have those kinds of courses in a curriculum, even at a place where students tend to be relatively similar to each other, they get a roommate or a friend down the hall that's different than them, and all of a sudden they have to confront the fact that people that they like think differently than them. And they begin to crack open just a little bit. But there is tremendous pressure in the culture now, not to countenance that, to stay firm. So I think it's one of those things, it's an art, not a science, in terms of how do you, and I think it's different probably for every kid, that you get to know. But it's a really important question, and one where we have no great answers, do we?
Counting on all of you.
Yeah. We're retired. We don't have to deal with this anymore.
Just a quick follow-up to that for me. It's often the universities that bolster up the fortress the most, that get rewarded the most in their fundraising. But the universities that call their students out of the fortress, though they're bringing a good education to their students, they often will sometimes get in trouble from their donors. Do you have any thoughts on that for the future of thriving evangelical universities? I don't know if some of the finance folks would want to speak to that, or maybe that's a different conference for a different day. But what are we at odds with ourselves, right? Good education versus also being able to fund the bills too.
I'm not a fundraiser, but I'm not sure we've done a good job, though, of selling the idea of what college is supposed to be. It's much easier to find people, that have one, pony they want to ride, and you can affirm them in that, and try to use that as a lure to get them to give you money. But I think my hunch is there's lots of people out there, especially now. Aren't all Americans hungry for a different way of being together with each other? Even Christians, we're hungry for a different way of not getting, we can't go on as a nation this way. How are we going to solve this? There's got to be people who are willing to fund that. If we can figure out how to articulate that and how to show them that we're going to operationalize it on campus. I know Ibu Patel is a friend of ours, and he does, Interfaith Youth Corps. It's now Interfaith America, I guess. They've changed it. He said when he went looking for money, the question always was, well, what's the bottom line? How are you going to do it? Explain it to me in 30 seconds or a minute. And he said, I have to figure out how to operationalize, how to explain this to ordinary people that are not academics, how to operationalize it. And it's a hard thing to do, but I think maybe we can work on that and do a better job with that. At least I certainly hope that's the case.
Dr. Fenstermacher, is that right? Or Dr. Lee, do you guys have a question for anyone?
I actually have a question for the Jacobsons, but anybody could really answer it. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and one of the jobs of a qualitative researcher is to take the stories of many and to build a theoretical understanding of that. And so as I was listening to my colleagues present today and thinking about the pathways, I wondered if you have done any reflection on how those concepts of each of the pathways, the conceptual labels that you have given each of them, might look if someone were to sketch it out or conceptualize a theory or framework, a way of thinking about the interrelatedness of each of those pathways. What would it look like?
We're going to ask the four of you to articulate it, and then we'll all put it together and do it. I will be straightforward here. We are absolutely sure that we got some things wrong in this book because it's new stuff. And we're like, seriously, you figure it out. If we messed it up, tell us where it's wrong and figure out how you can use it or what can't be used in ways that will help students bring their faith into their learning and faculty feel affirmed in bringing their own faith into their learning. And we don't have it figured out in detail. So back to you.
Yeah, and again, I think the 4 pathways, there's lots of interconnections between them, but I don't want to risk tying it to a chair and beating it with a hose because I think there's lots of different ways. Actually, Kent and we went back and forth on this, and there's lots of ways we could begin to construct, well, this is connected here, this is more foundational, and this comes next. But then you can always find counterexamples for how it works a different way. So, for us, it's just 4 different pathways, and they interconnect for different people in different ways at different times in their lives, and it's hard to predict.
And I think that's what my point, I was hoping you'd say something like that. I see it as not linear, not sequential, but very interactive, and perhaps some taking a more hierarchy at other times, and depending on where each pilgrim is, right? So, thanks.
One last thing I would say is I think the 4 pathways turn our attention away from what we're thinking to how we're thinking. And I think if there's with the rise of AI and everything else, I think teaching students how to think, we used to just say critical thinking, but it's more than that. Teaching students how to think, the content they can look up online instantly on their phones, and they can get answers on AI, but they've got to be able to process all that. And if you can give them ways of thinking, ways of processing it, I think that's the key.
I have a question. Was there one down there? Okay. Mine relates a little bit both to proclamation and to the compassion. I'm going to frame it with the compassion thinking first, but I think it relates to both. I really appreciated the distinction between kind of compassion and compassion thinking. And as I was thinking about it, I feel like it was almost more like a focus on compassion acting rather than, like there's a compassion thinking component, but the activity of compassion seems like such an important part of that particular pathway. So I wondered if you could, and proclamation had some of the same flavor to it in terms of, in experiencing you get worked on, right? Like there was work done on you. And so I wondered if you might reflect a little bit on to what extent is compassion thinking kind of a bridge between theory and practice, and to what extent is compassion thinking, would a better label be compassion acting? I'm not suggesting that it would be, I'm just trying to probe at that. And similar for proclamation. Proclamation is a very active verb, so I'm trying to think about the relationship between Christianity and intellectual inquiry and then this experiential component.
It's a great question, especially for a nurse, because we move theory into practice all the time. Of the 4 pathways, I think compassion thinking, even the Jacobsons talked about this, being the one that is action-oriented. It's very pragmatic. You can measure it, unlike the other 3. And so I think that's probably the answer, is to be mindful of measuring what you're doing and always checking with the people who you're doing for. Am I doing it right? Did I solve the problem? Did I do enough? And I think without that measurement, that reflection back, and perhaps then changing the direction and doing something different to get to the end result that you want, it's not as not worthwhile is not the word I want to say, but it's not reflective of what you really want to do in terms of compassion thinking. So I don't know if that answers. The heart of compassion requires the feedback, and it requires doing it for the sake of doing the right thing, not judging the worthiness of the people that you're doing it for. I love that. I love that which one of you, confess, thought of that? I know that's not true. Now that I found out that Rhonda wrote part and Jake wrote other parts, now I want to know who said that, right? So I'll pass it on to, was it Kent that you wanted the other?
Yeah, I appreciate so much when you framed the proclamation pathway that you actually use the language of map in there. I mean, you could frame it another way in terms of something static, but it would be so inconsistent with the pilgrimage metaphor, the pathway metaphor. So, I mean, I think what I was searching for as I was engaging the content was something like what you did with compassion acting, that I was trying to get somewhere into the territory of life on the map. Like, what's it actually look like when you live? As that, again, a test of this proclaimed vision of reality. And I don't think that's something that earlier in my life I would have understood as well. It's just life has taught me that, I think. And again, back to my students, I'm consistently interacting with students who are dismayed at what they see the Christianity that they know producing in the world. And I think that pushed me in some ways into the way the paper was framed. My own children have been dismayed at some of what they've seen, the Christianity that they've known produce in the world. And so I think that pushed me into the territory of trying to figure out how does life on the map lead us to look at the maps that we've maybe developed, taken for granted, et cetera.
I want to pick on Dr. Lee, if you'd pass the mic. I know she's got some questions written there.
Sure. So as I was listening to all these different wonderful thoughts, something that occurred in my mind is across our campuses in the CCCU, there are a lot of initiatives around engaging students in civil discourse. So we exhort our faculty to model civil engagement and thoughtful civil discourse in the classroom and in their co-curricular activities. And we might even have, many conferences about it or something. So in relation to this particular NetView conference on vocation, about Christian faith integration, and the Jacobson's wonderful book, I thought maybe it'd be interesting for us to share on our campuses in our pilgrimages together, what does that look like in terms of civil engagement? So we have, fortress thinking, and some of our students have been sort of schooled to think this type of fortress thinking is, uber orthodox is what I'll just make up a term for it. And not yet aware that actually in these fortresses, and to a certain extent we're all in different kinds of fortresses, that there's some ingredients in these fortresses that will kind of trap you for life and block you from all that God has designed you to do, and that all the things that in His creation are available to humanity for His good and for His glory. And so I'll distill it. So how do we mentor and disciple our students in the hard work of seeing the Imago Dei in a polarized context, seeing the Imago Dei in a person who's remarkably different? Maybe comes from a very wealthy background, very not so wealthy background, another nation, a life of maybe mental health issues, suffering, so all the kinds of things that humans experience, and ultimately our shared suffering and our fallenness. How do we mentor our students to see and honor the Imago Dei in other people? And that is part of being a Christian believer and how to be a human who's a Christian believer. So how are we doing that on our campuses? Who wants to jump in?
One of the opportunities I have in working in the John Wesley Honors College at Indiana Wesleyan University, it's a program that's been It's been established over 25 years, and it's an honors college, so we actually really grateful for the institution investing in full-time teaching faculty, and we just teach honor students. But what we're able to do with those students is surround them around a kind of big questions curriculum. And so the curriculum then fulfills all their general education requirements through classes such as what is truth, what is beauty, what is humanity, who is my neighbor, what is the good life. So as we think about the different pathways towards reality, towards what is real, we're really asking questions of what are the pathways towards what is true? What is the pathways towards what is good? What is the pathway towards what is beautiful? And it's one of those deals, because we're able to have a percentage of our undergrad students in this curriculum, we're able to engage them in questions, but they're doing the questions in community. And so those who are maybe a bit more fortress thinking on the front end are a whole lot more charitable towards their peers come year 4. And so I have the opportunity both to teach the first year experience class, but then also the senior capstone. And it's so fun being with seniors on the other side and just seeing the curriculum at work.
Yeah, that really dovetails nicely with what I could share out from my campus. So we have a lot of those same questions embedded in our first year seminar for our freshmen. And we also have an interdisciplinary studies program where students can design their own major and research a set of big questions that they're interested in exploring. And so I'm always watching what the students are doing there, because that tells me, where Gen Z is right now and what kinds of things are they interested in. So this human thing, and Imago Dei has surfaced quite a bit lately, probably because of the age of artificial intelligence, as well as suffering. Suffering has always been a sort of popular theme. Another thing we do is, so I come from an assessment background as well as accreditation. And so one thing we do, we have a statement for a vision for Wheaton graduates, and it's sort of parsed out by intellectual virtues. So biblical humility, know who you are before God, and also intellectual humility, having humble curiosity and sort of sharing in received discovery where you participate in learning together. That's not just mere knowledge for self-possession and self-glory and so forth. And so with these intellectual virtues that are aligned to our institutional learning outcomes, there's also a way to sort of thread them into program learning, and that becomes a more systematized way to kind of show that we are demonstrating civil discourse, meeting outcomes there, expectations. We're also able to show this to some of our publics and our constituencies who ask questions. So yeah, it's very similar to what I was doing as well.
I think I really appreciate the question. I think some of the challenge is actually coming from well outside of the university. I was reminded of the Chronicle of Higher Education did a reprise article. So I'm not sure when it was originally published. It might have been around 2016, but the title was something around, the day the direction of education changed or something like that. And it actually harkens back to a speech by Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. And I don't have the exact quote in front of me right now, but it was something along the lines of, we're not going to do education for that foo-foo humanities stuff anymore. We're going to do education for things that, that really matter, that, like science and engineering. And he really, his impact, the arc of his impact, I think, we're still seeing that in, it's combined too with the cost of higher education, which in some ways we would say it's gone up a great deal. In the other sense, if you compare it to inflation, it's really more that it can't be mass produced. And so the cost of everything else hasn't gone up in the same way that something that can't be mass produced has to go up because you continue to pay labor costs. But at the risk of getting too far down the road on that, earlier, I think it was Jeff who mentioned the, you can't, when did you go into being a pastor to make a lot of money? the federal government is putting pretty strict requirements on how much income our graduates are going to make compared to their peers. You have to prove that the degree was quote unquote worth it. And the way that that value is being measured is by how much income the graduates are going to make. Now, I'm not going to make the case that we actually want to say education has no ROI. I mean, we don't want to say, go to college, you'll definitely be poor. So we're not trying to go that route. But I'm bringing this out as the arc of what began in the most recent fluctuation from Ronald Reagan's speech as governor was to say that the point of being educated is utility. It's efficiency, it's utility, it's money, it's wholly economic. And so, I sit here as a chemist provost saying, regardless of how each of our institutions do this, we are committed to the questions of the humanities. What is it to be human? Asking those questions are questions that lead us on journeys and pathways and poetry. And music, and AI is just the latest challenge that we're encountering on a whole long list of challenges to these questions of what it is to be a faithful Christian human person on a journey.
If I may, real quick. This past week, David Brooks had a wonderful article in The Atlantic on what colleges and universities are doing right. And it is just he is applauding the humanities departments because I think in this day and age, he recognizes that young individuals are asking the question of what makes a life meaningful? And Brooks does a great job hiring a wide variety of different types of institutions on how they're leveraging the humanities, it's really phenomenal if you get a chance to check that out.
I thought it might be a good time to move to questions from the table. Luke, were you going to walk around with a mic, or should I do that? I forget how. You got it. Okay. So you each have a question at the ready. Who would like to be the first to go? Because I can start calling on tables, too.
Well, earlier today, Mark said he was afraid if he took the mic, he'd just drool into it because he didn't have his answer or question for him. But maybe you've gotten it now.
I might do that right now. No. This is kind of a follow-up to what you were just talking about. It seems that not only is there this move toward utilitarian use of college, but also I've observed as a campus pastor, students wanting to come in and get through it as quickly as possible, to neglect things like the spiritual life or other aspects of learning that they don't see is going to get them to that next thing. So I'm seeing it's the water we're swimming in on all fronts. With that in mind, I'm thinking about the phrase, Dr. Lee, you were saying about knowledge or wisdom is not seized upon but received. And that is very different than what I'm seeing a lot of students coming in to college doing. They're wanting to get the thing, whatever the thing is, as quickly as possible to move to the next thing, rather than being in a process and on a journey and a pilgrimage. So with that in mind, as I want to go to you first, as you're thinking about this idea of this receive, like being received, having an open posture, that kind of thing. Do you guys have thoughts on how we foster and help students to begin to open rather than being driven by our cultural moment and then kind of just going into that seizing kind of mentality?
Yeah, well, part of the reason why students come to a 4-year, primarily undergraduate residential community and pay top dollar is because they want the experience. But selling experience is even harder nowadays. And so something that I've heard our faculty and also our senior cabinet talk about is that the community is lifelong, and you can't really put a price tag on that. If they want to be utilitarian about it, it's your network. So you will build an incredible network with relationships. You can't seize friends. You create friendships. You have to sit with each other. You have to walk with each other through messy things. And so that helps you become a better Christian, a better leader. It's not just populating the workforce with these good employees, although that is a good outcome of this 4-year experience and maybe graduate degrees. If your institutions also offer graduate degrees, maybe you're now trying to have your undergraduates do like a 4 to 5 year graduate degree. It's storytelling in a meaningful way that acknowledges the ask that prospective students and families do have, but also presenting and modeling to them the wisdom that we are educating for eternity. So it's not just this 3.5 years or a 90-credit bachelor's degree. And if you want to do that, that is fine. Beyond that, we also offer more. We have eyes towards eternity. It is just an earthbound journey at this very moment. We are actually educating heavenward.
I started thinking about the word curiosity and how in the Christian tradition, the long Christian tradition, curiosity was a kind of a bad word. Because curiositas was what you do when you want to know something about something simply for knowing it. And so you grasp knowledge. It's a knowledge of control and use. And Christians consistently push back on this. That to know something truly and really is to know it within the story of the world as God's creation and ourselves as God's people. And so I think that one of the gifts we give students in the utilitarian age at a Christian institution like ours, at least, I believe you guys are doing the same, is we're helping students to situate the larger story within which knowledge acquisition takes place. And for a student who doesn't have their own faith commitment, you can't say like, hey, you have to believe this. But man, the calling to present it winsomely and relationally and compellingly. I'm thinking of Badir, a delightful Muslim student I had this last semester in a class, and the relationship he and I built across the semester. He didn't convert to Christianity, but man, across the stretch of the semester as we talked, he just expressed like his understanding of how Christians are in the world expanded so dramatically. And so for him, he might not himself like situate himself within the Christian story, but as he goes out into the world, he has such a better understanding of the Christians he will interact with, of like, what is it for them to see the world Christianly? And so I think that's one of the great gifts we give in a utilitarian age is to say, yeah, I mean, you are training for a career. And this is a part of a story, a larger story, a vocation, a calling. And man, that transforms the thing in my mind.
Thanks, guys. Let's do another question at the tables. Who's got one?
Could each of you share in 10 seconds or 15 seconds your practical takeaway? So as you think about everything you heard, what's one thing that comes to mind that's like, I want to start applying this in my life? So what's one practical takeaway?
All right, I'll start. I'll give everybody 10 more seconds to think. I really appreciated the articulation of the value of ritual for punctuating our lives in ways that center us and can bring us contemplation. So that was a good takeaway for me.
I've always thought this, but I feel even stronger today, that to the point that we have to teach students how to think. And we have to teach, especially nursing students, if I could put it into context for me. I know you said 15 seconds, I'm sorry. We have to teach nursing students because they're coming to college, their first intersection with suffering and death is when they're maybe 19 or 20 years old in a clinical rotation. They don't know how to unpack that. But that humanities foundation, that learning about the Imago Dei, that learning how to deal with suffering that they get in their humanities, their ethics classes, and then this nursing faculty, putting that all together, teach them how to think like Christian nurses. That's the long game. That keeps them in the profession. That's what we want, so.
Yeah, and for me, incongruence had resonance for me. In this moment, how as I serve the people, the faculty and students and staff whom I serve at Wheaton, how can I help to continue to shepherd them through this moment of incongruence, to create space so that they can reflect and not be swallowed up by the busyness of everything that they have to do, of the distractions of the moment and the polarization. So I'm continuing to pray and think about that.
I was just reminded, we do not think alone. And so choose your fellow pilgrims wisely.
It's a great question. I don't know what my takeaway is. It'll crystallize over the next couple of days, I'm sure. But what I know is what I've experienced today, and that's been just the beauty of your friendship, the mutuality of sharing and listening, and that's just been a gift.
I think one of the takeaways for me is that everybody starts where they are. And you have to respect that. If students come in, whatever their ideas are, they need to be respected. And then you can poke and prod them a little bit and say, well, how does your identity deal with this one? But I think we have to start with respect. Everybody starts where we are. You can't come in saying, we're going to change these students all and go right at them. I think that's a recipe for disaster. You just get pushed back.
And I'm just thinking about the combination between respect and congruence, and how it's a combination of respecting differences while also honoring and looking for the congruence of shared loyalties and commitments to God and humankind.
All right. Let's do another question from the table. As Luke is making his way over there with the mic, not that it's a long commute, but I thought if you guys could be just kind of percolating in the background, I've found it really beneficial during this time to write a bit of a reading list for myself. So from some of your presentations, you mentioned certain books, and I wrote down a few. And so I thought maybe at the end, after a few more questions, it would be fun just to rapid fire here one or two books that you each recommend as we maybe maybe we're all building a reading list, whether from your presentation today or just something that really has moved you and encouraged your life and thinking, whether fiction or not, in the last year. So be thinking about that as we do the next couple of questions, and maybe we can end with that, and people can take some rewarding, beyond, of course, the Jacobson's book, which is the top of the list for our reading material. But beyond that, we can keep building out our reading list to keep this conversation going. Okay, go ahead.
We've been talking kind of about this idea of Christianity and intellectual inquiry, primarily as individual intellectual inquiry. What possibilities do you all see for cultivating or engaging these four pathways as a collective or communally? So not just doing it simultaneously alongside other people, but collective attention for reverence, collective proclamation, collective contemplation, collective expression of compassion. What might that look like? And especially imagining communities that are really diverse and have power differentials within them. What possibilities do you see?
I'll say one thing just to begin with. In another one of our books that we wrote, we talked about a student who was telling us, I went to college and it took me a while, but I finally found my tribe. And I could talk and think with them because it wasn't an echo chamber, but they were enough like me that we understood each other and understood our questions. I'm not quite sure how you facilitate that, but I think what we want, what happens now, I think, have to be these sort of naturally congealing groups, not preformed groups that you're a part of. And it's a different social arrangement, and we haven't figured out as a culture exactly how to encourage that, I don't think, yet.
So something we do on our campus, which I believe many of your campuses do, is For our first year seminar, we have what we call a core book that all the students read together. And so this upcoming academic year, it's Alan Jacobs' Breaking Bread with the Dead. It's got bread and dead in it, but it's actually a very uplifting book. And Alan Jacobs is very brilliant. So we read this book together, and so the students are walking in community with each other through the core book. We also have parallel, and this is actually run through the Christ at the Core, which is our general education program, the Christ at the Core faculty director, and also human resources. We have parallel staff groups where we provide the books, and they meet about once a month to talk about what they're reading in the book. And we have faculty members for a very modest stipend guide some of these discussions and do mini lectures. So our staff employees also get a little taste of what students are experiencing in their shared pilgrimage journey of shared inquiry. So they get little mini book groups, basically. The other thing that started happening organically after COVID is that some of our faculty started pooling some funds, some mysterious funds, which actually they're not mysterious anymore because I know where they're coming from. So there's some special funds that certain departments have, which they share with each other, and they designed a spiritual retreat, their own type of Sabbath renewal. So they get away to a somewhat low-cost local retreat center, and they pick a book. They have a little curriculum that they wrote together. It's about a half a dozen of them, and they do this about once a year. I was so excited about it that I try to find some more funds so we can have more of these mini retreat type of faculty circles to encourage community, especially among faculty who are less represented in our demographics. So we're more culturally and racially, ethnically diverse faculty. Also, some of our majority faculty are actually international faculty who also experience some isolation. And so we're trying to encourage all these different faculty to self-organize into retreats as funds allow. And they can pick a book, they can have a curriculum or not. All they have to do is take a picture, show it to me, and then write a little paragraph about what they did. So it's easy on the reporting as well.
If you're thinking about ideas like this, if you're not already a member of NetView, or if you're thinking about becoming a member of NetView, NetView has a wonderful grant program. They have a professional development grant. I think John can correct me, I think it's $25,000 for a year for a professional development grant, which is, we talked about, Kim was talking about, you also need funding. So if you're thinking about ways to start something like this, I encourage you to look at the opportunities through NetView. Also, the Lilly Network does some things that are similar with small grants available for things like what Karen was just talking about. Those opportunities to get away on a retreat and maybe read the Jacobson's book together with some faculty. I know also in our general education curriculum, we've really started to use more learning communities, and that can mean a lot of different things, those words. But in this case, it's really trying to help the same group of students be across multiple classes so that they can engage with one another around some of the same questions at the same time and start to build community. So things like that.
Thanks. I've been using this clock, and I realize it's a couple minutes slow, actually. So I thought if you got a 10-second book recommendation, we could build our list, and then we can move into our coffee time together.
My favorite book about vocation is Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry, because it's so odd.
Well, Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. If you want a long read that will put you to sleep, you can read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, which it's 800 pages long. He should have had an editor. It should be 300 pages long, but when you're Charles Taylor, you can publish 800 pages. But it helps to understand the complexity of sort of the sacred secular divide in culture today, and it's very helpful.
I really like novels for communicating ideas, for storytelling. If you're thinking about courage, I would suggest The Awakening, which might strike some people as strange, but it's one of my favorite books. If you're thinking about how to build community in teaching, I'd read any of David Smith's books on Christian teaching or Everyday Christian Teaching by David Smith.
I'll recommend again Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. That I'm not through that book yet, but something I read recently, I think it's called Abba Father, Brennan Manning's book. Do you know that book? It's and I read it last summer, so it's not, I think that's the title. Particularly the passages on cultivating solitude, found really helpful.
Sure. So I'd recommend a book of essays, Helpful Realism for this age. Brian McGraw's one of our faculty, and he collaborated with some other folks, I think from Biola, maybe Pepperdine. Also, one of our faculty members in the business department, Denise Daniels. So Brian McGraw's a political scientist. Denise Daniels is in the business department, and she wrote a book on faith and work with Elaine Eckert, which is really good, which I've been recommending to a lot of people.
One book on more of the pace of things, especially within the academic, is entitled The Slow Professor. And really great book, and it's even better if you read it with your colleagues, and then all of a sudden you begin respecting one another's space just a little bit more. So The Slow Professor. And then as it relates to the humanities, since Rhonda already said Jayber Crow, that was going to be mine by Wendell Berry. So second vote for Jayber Crow, but also read Theo of Golden, a novel. It's great. Yeah, I think like in reading Theo of Golden, I often think of like, this is what I hope the outcome of my students, what their lives look like. And so.
In my paper, I mentioned Adrienne Black's story. Her memoir, The Klansman's Son, it hasn't been out long, in 2021, I think, but it was preceded by a book called Rising Out of Hatred by the journalist Eli Laszlo. And I tell you what, it is so inspiring. Adrienne Black's journey is Adrienne Black's journey. But where it happened on a liberal arts campus. And it was through not just the community there, but the exposure to ideas and intellectual inquiry and friendship and honest question seeking. I mean, it's just, I would highly recommend either Rising Out of Hatred or The Klansman's Son.
All right, why don't we put our hands together for our panelists, and I'll call Dr. Pepper up.